In this episode, we take the most frustrating moment in vulnerability management, VM, and turn it into a disciplined decision process that reduces risk instead of creating endless argument. The frustrating moment is when you have a long list of findings and every item is labeled important, urgent, or critical by some generic rule, yet you know you cannot fix everything at once. Prioritization is the skill that turns that list into a short sequence of actions that actually matters to the business. It is also the difference between a program that steadily gets safer and a program that stays busy while risk quietly stays the same. The core idea you will learn is that technical severity is only one input, while context is what tells you what is truly urgent in your environment. Context in this episode has three pillars: exposure, criticality, and exploit signals, and each pillar changes how you interpret a vulnerability and how you defend the next step. A vulnerability is best understood as a weakness that could be used to cause harm, but the existence of a weakness does not automatically mean the same level of risk everywhere. Many beginners assume that if a scanner assigns a high rating, the vulnerability must be handled immediately, but that is a shortcut that often wastes effort. A risk rating can describe what is possible in general, but it rarely describes what is likely and damaging in your specific environment today. Context is what connects the generic possibility to your actual pathways, your actual assets, and your actual attacker incentives. Without context, teams end up chasing the loudest number in a report and ignoring the quiet issues that create the biggest exposure. With context, you can explain why one vulnerability on one system is a top priority while the same vulnerability on another system is not. That explanation is not about excuses, and it is about using limited remediation capacity where it produces the most risk reduction. Exposure is the first pillar because it answers the most practical question in vulnerability prioritization, which is whether an attacker can realistically reach the weakness and use it. Exposure is not simply whether a system exists on a network, and it is the combination of reachability, permissions, and pathways. A vulnerability on a system that accepts inbound traffic from the internet has a very different exposure profile than the same vulnerability on a system that only accepts traffic from one internal service. Exposure also includes lateral movement considerations, because an attacker may not need internet access if they can reach the vulnerable system from a compromised workstation. Beginners often focus only on external exposure and forget that internal exposure can be just as dangerous when networks are flat or when credentials are broadly usable. The purpose of exposure thinking is to prioritize vulnerabilities that have open doors or easy ladders connected to them. When you ask how an attacker would reach this weakness, you are already doing better than any generic score that ignores your network design. A strong way to reason about exposure is to think in terms of attack paths rather than in terms of individual machines. An attack path is the sequence of steps an attacker would take to move from their starting point to the vulnerable system and then to something valuable. If the vulnerable system is reachable from many places, the path is short, and short paths tend to produce higher likelihood because they require fewer successes. If the vulnerable system is behind segmentation, requires specific authentication, and is reachable only through narrow routes, the path is longer and more fragile, which reduces practical exposure. Exposure also includes the concept of blast radius, because even if an attacker reaches the vulnerable system, you want to know what access that system would grant them afterward. A vulnerability on a system with broad network access, broad permissions, or privileged roles creates higher exposure because compromise becomes a stepping stone. Beginners sometimes see exposure as a yes or no question, but exposure is more like a gradient because the number of routes, the ease of routes, and the power gained all matter. When you can describe the path and the blast radius, your prioritization becomes grounded in reality. Criticality is the second pillar, and it answers a different question than exposure, which is how much the business would care if this system were compromised or disrupted. Criticality includes the importance of the system's function, the sensitivity of the data it touches, and the consequences of loss of availability. For example, a system that supports customer transactions, identity, or core operations is usually more critical than a lab system used for experimentation. Criticality also includes dependencies, because a system may seem minor until you realize many other services rely on it, making it a single point of failure. Beginners often evaluate criticality only by how important the system feels to the technical team, but business criticality is about what breaks for customers, revenue, and operations. Criticality is also time-sensitive because a system might be more critical during a peak season or a major launch, and that can change the impact of risk. When you incorporate criticality, you ensure that remediation capacity goes first to the weaknesses that threaten the outcomes the organization values most. Criticality becomes clearer when you separate technical importance from business importance and then reconnect them thoughtfully. A technical team might call a system important because it is complex or because it is hard to maintain, but the business might call a system important because it affects customer trust or contractual obligations. Both views matter, and the vulnerability program should learn to translate between them. For instance, an identity system is technically central because it touches access everywhere, and it is also business critical because identity compromise can lead to widespread disruption and loss of trust. Likewise, a shared file service might seem routine, but it can be critical if it contains sensitive documents or if many teams depend on it for daily work. Beginners sometimes try to build a single criticality label for everything, but criticality can be multidimensional, including confidentiality impact, integrity impact, and availability impact. A system can be low sensitivity but high availability critical, such as a scheduling service, or high sensitivity but not time critical, such as an archive system. When you understand these dimensions, you can prioritize vulnerabilities in a way that matches the true business stakes. Exploit signals are the third pillar, and they are the most dynamic because they change rapidly as attacker behavior changes. An exploit signal is evidence that a vulnerability is being actively exploited, is easy to exploit, or is likely to be exploited soon because the path is well known. This evidence can include public reports of active exploitation, widespread availability of exploit code, or observed scanning and attack attempts against your environment. For beginners, the key insight is that a vulnerability can move from moderate urgency to top urgency when credible exploit signals appear. The opposite can also happen because some vulnerabilities are dramatic in theory but rarely exploited in practice due to complexity or limited reachability. Exploit signals help you avoid two common mistakes at the same time: overreacting to every high score and underreacting to the vulnerabilities attackers are actually using today. They also help you defend urgency to stakeholders, because it is easier to justify rapid action when you can explain that exploitation is not hypothetical. When you treat exploit signals as a living input, prioritization becomes responsive without becoming panicked. It is important to understand what exploit signals can and cannot tell you, because beginners sometimes treat them like certainty. An exploit signal does not guarantee you will be attacked, but it increases likelihood because the barrier for attackers is lower and the incentive for attackers is higher. At the same time, lack of public exploit signal does not mean you are safe, because attackers can exploit vulnerabilities quietly or use private methods. The right mindset is to treat exploit signals as accelerators and amplifiers of priority rather than as the only trigger for action. Another beginner misunderstanding is to assume exploit signals are purely external news, but internal signals matter too, such as repeated probing of a service, unusual authentication attempts, or detections that suggest related attacker behavior. Internal monitoring can reveal that your environment is being targeted even if the broader world is not talking about it yet. Exploit signals also vary by industry, because some sectors are targeted more aggressively, making certain vulnerabilities more urgent in those contexts. When you combine external and internal signals, you build a priority system that reflects both the global threat landscape and your local reality. When you bring exposure, criticality, and exploit signals together, you can make prioritization decisions that are consistent and explainable instead of arbitrary. A vulnerability with high exposure, high criticality, and strong exploit signals is typically the clearest candidate for immediate action because it is reachable, damaging, and actively targeted. A vulnerability with low exposure but high criticality might still be urgent if compromise would be catastrophic and if compensating controls are weak, because the organization may choose not to tolerate that residual risk. A vulnerability with high exposure but low criticality might be handled quickly if it is easy to fix and could be used as a stepping stone, because low criticality does not always mean low risk in a connected environment. A vulnerability with high criticality but weak exploit signals might be scheduled into planned work, especially if strong segmentation and monitoring reduce exposure, but it should not be forgotten. The point is not to force every situation into a single formula, but to have a structured way to reason that can be repeated. Beginners often want a single ranking that always works, but real prioritization is disciplined judgment supported by consistent factors. This context-driven approach also helps you use Common Vulnerability Scoring System, CVSS, and Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures, CVE, information correctly, which is as inputs rather than as final answers. CVE identifiers are useful because they let everyone talk about the same weakness unambiguously, and they help track remediation across tools and teams. CVSS can be useful because it summarizes technical severity in a standardized way, but it does not know your network topology, your asset criticality, or your attacker targeting. Beginners often treat CVSS as a priority queue, but that approach can lead to fixing the loudest issues while leaving the most dangerous paths open. A better approach is to treat CVSS as the starting point that tells you the potential of the weakness, then use exposure to determine reachability, criticality to determine business impact, and exploit signals to determine urgency. This is similar to how doctors use general medical risk factors, but still evaluate the patient's specific condition and environment. When you apply this discipline, you become less vulnerable to misleading scanner rankings and more capable of defending your own prioritization decisions. Prioritization also has to account for control environment and compensating controls, because those controls change exposure and impact even when the vulnerability itself does not change. If a system is behind strict segmentation, uses strong authentication, and is monitored with high-quality telemetry, the practical likelihood and impact may be lower than the same system in a flat, noisy environment. That does not mean you ignore the vulnerability, and it means you can place it correctly in the queue relative to other risks. Compensating controls are also critical when a fix is delayed, because delaying remediation without compensations is often just silent acceptance. For example, if a patch cannot be applied immediately due to operational constraints, reducing exposure by restricting network access or limiting the vulnerable service's reach can be a valuable interim step. Beginners sometimes think the only meaningful action is patching, but risk reduction can also come from narrowing paths, tightening permissions, and increasing monitoring until a permanent fix is applied. The value of the context model is that it naturally points to these actions, because when exposure is the key driver, reducing exposure becomes a legitimate mitigation. Over time, this mindset helps vulnerability work become less confrontational because the conversation becomes about options, not blame. A common beginner struggle is how to prioritize when everything seems urgent, and the answer is to create a consistent decision habit rather than relying on emotional urgency. One part of that habit is to define what counts as high exposure in your environment, such as internet reachability, broad internal reachability, or access from user device zones. Another part is to define criticality in business terms, such as revenue impact, safety impact, legal impact, or widespread operational disruption. Another part is to define what exploit signals trigger acceleration, such as credible reports of active exploitation or internal evidence of targeted scanning. You do not need perfect thresholds to begin, but you do need consistency, because consistency builds trust with partner teams. When teams see that the same types of conditions produce the same urgency decisions, they are more likely to accept tough timelines. Beginners often worry that consistent prioritization will miss edge cases, but consistency does not eliminate judgment, and it provides a stable baseline that judgment can adjust when needed. The real danger is inconsistent urgency, where teams learn to wait for the next reclassification rather than acting. When your prioritization habit is stable, remediation becomes faster because debate shrinks and action grows. This context-driven approach also improves communication because it gives you a language for explaining trade-offs without hiding risk. If you prioritize one vulnerability ahead of another, you can explain that it has higher exposure because it is reachable from more places, higher criticality because it affects a core service, or stronger exploit signals because attackers are actively using it. That explanation is far more persuasive than simply saying it is critical because the scanner said so. It also helps when you need to ask for resources or scheduling support, because you can describe how delays increase exposure windows and how those windows interact with active exploitation. For beginners, a major growth step is learning that remediation urgency must be defendable to people who do not live in security every day. They will often ask why now and why this, and context is the answer. Context also makes it easier to talk about exceptions and risk acceptance, because an exception should not be granted when exposure is high and exploit signals are strong unless leadership truly understands the stakes. When communication is built on context, vulnerability management becomes a shared risk conversation rather than a technical argument. Prioritization is also closely tied to verification and learning, because you should be able to look back and see whether your priority model matched reality. If you consistently prioritize based on exploit signals, but still see incidents coming from unexploited-looking vulnerabilities, that is a signal that your model needs adjustment or that your exposure assumptions are wrong. If you prioritize based on internet exposure, but repeatedly suffer internal lateral movement issues, that may reveal that internal exposure is higher than you thought due to flat networks or shared credentials. If you prioritize based on criticality but still experience widespread disruption from supposedly low critical systems, that can reveal hidden dependencies you did not understand. Beginners sometimes treat prioritization as a one-time step, but in a mature program it is a feedback loop that improves over time. Each incident, near miss, and remediation success teaches you something about what mattered and what did not. That learning can then refine how you define exposure, how you classify criticality, and how you interpret exploit signals. When your prioritization process learns, it becomes more accurate and more trusted, which accelerates future remediation. To keep this approach practical, it helps to remember that prioritization is not only about which vulnerabilities to fix first, but also about which actions reduce risk fastest in the face of constraints. Sometimes the fastest risk reduction comes from patching, and sometimes it comes from reducing exposure quickly while a patch is tested and scheduled. Sometimes the fastest risk reduction comes from correcting a configuration mistake that created broad reachability, which can shrink blast radius across many vulnerabilities at once. Sometimes the fastest risk reduction comes from focusing on a small number of critical systems that act as gateways, such as identity or remote access services, because improving them reduces exposure across the environment. Beginners often think vulnerability work is a straight line from finding to patching, but real programs use a toolkit of mitigations while still pursuing permanent fixes. This is why context is so valuable, because context tells you which lever matters most right now. Exposure tells you where to close doors, criticality tells you which rooms matter most, and exploit signals tell you how fast you need to move. When you think this way, even a busy program can make progress that is visible and defensible. As we close, prioritizing vulnerabilities using context is about replacing generic urgency with disciplined reasoning that matches how risk actually behaves. Exposure tells you whether the weakness is reachable and what pathways and blast radius make it practically dangerous. Criticality tells you what business outcomes are at stake and how severe harm would be if the weakness were used. Exploit signals tell you how active and imminent the threat is, helping you accelerate the right work when attacker behavior changes. Together, these pillars help you treat CVE and CVSS data as useful inputs without allowing them to override the reality of your environment. They also help you communicate priorities convincingly, coordinate remediation without constant renegotiation, and learn from outcomes so the program improves over time. For brand new learners, the most important takeaway is that context turns vulnerability management from a noisy list into a risk reduction engine, because it points limited effort at the weaknesses that are most reachable, most damaging, and most likely to be exploited right now. When you prioritize with this discipline, you build trust, you reduce exposure windows, and you make security progress that can be measured and defended.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.